in the presidency.
Well, it definitely reframes who our most urgent enemies are and who the most serious bad guys are. I mean, what I've been saying to people for some time now is, it's very interesting that the Times reported this morning, and, certainly we can have our questions about the Times, but some of their reporting on these issues is still sound. They reported that the former head of MI5 in Britain, Stella Rimington, I believe is her name, was saying that the U.S. approach to terrorism is very counterproductive, and that she and others in Britain are calling for a rollback of the kind of surveillance society, stripping of habeas corpus society that had been going along in a mission creep, certainly the way ours has, and that she is calling for restoring civil liberties and democratic processes as being the best safeguard against terrorism. And she said she doesn't agree that there's a global war on terror, that it's a crime, and it should be treated as a crime. And what I've been saying to audiences for some time is, yes, we are facing, terrorists, just like Spain and England faced terrorists, and they dealt with them in civil processes and put the transcripts on the internet in the case of Spain, but that we've got to understand that if we lose our freedoms, we have worse enemies, we have worse problems than terrorism.
Well, terrorism is such an infinitesimal problem as compared to what we face from the federal government. And even when they killed like 1 million innocents in Iraq in response to what Osama bin Laden did. So this is, hardly responsible. It's hardly appropriate. It's hardly a just war. It's, in fact, a very evil war of aggression. But that's, of course, been most of the U.S. wars throughout history have been wars of aggression to take away other people's freedoms, not to protect our freedoms.
Yeah, you're so right. You're so right. I learned, with this last of the 7 principles, Principle 7 is that the founders saw liberty as being a universal human right, not restricted to Americans. And many of them would have been appalled at a situation that we've turned a blind eye to or tolerated of, as long as we've got a semblance of a free society at home, we will tolerate or not oppose or not get too worked up about a foreign policy that since 1898 has been sending our army on behest of corporate interests to subvert elected governments overseas or to install vicious dictators, that do to our people exactly what we stood up to George III to prevent. I think that when people really complete their awakening, and again, I've got to credit Ron Paul for this because he said it more pithily than anyone I'd read. He said something like, we should give up our empire and become a republic again. And I think there are many progressives who, would heartily endorse that. That's one of those transpartisan things, for us to wake up. It reminds me a lot of the middle of the 19th century when many white Americans woke up to just not being able to tolerate colluding with slavery, and they became really morally uncomfortable and uneasy, and that was good because they were facing truth. I think that we're starting to wake up to this very profound abandonment of our role as Americans, as supporters of freedom. Kind of abandonment of this light we're supposed to support and embody, in looking at our foreign policy and looking at how around the world, we're sending our brave men and women to do the bidding of corporations and massacre people and arrest journalists and, disappear people, again and again and again. And that's why some of the action steps at the end of the book are, how to divest of your empire. But some of the things you've said, I'm almost scared talking to you and the sort of particularly well-informed members of your community, because some of the theory that you offer makes things make sense that don't otherwise make sense. And here's what I mean. When you were talking about the Federal Reserve and kind of the recirculating of money from the bankers to the military-industrial complex to the politicians and so on, it's that cycle alone that explains, the Iraq War is a totally failed war as a matter of statecraft, but it's totally successful for laundering money. It's totally successful as a kind of high-level theft operation.
Sure, billions, as you've talked about, billions in cash disappeared.
Right.
And nobody even cares. Nobody cares about that. And, of course, then there have been sort of the open payoffs to Halliburton and all the rest of the companies connected with the government who were running the occupation, very vicious and immoral occupation in Iraq. So yeah, there's a lot of money to be made out of government, out of quote unquote public service.
Right, but it kind of explains the whole messaging around the war because, one keeps being puzzled, well, this war is a disaster, but it doesn't see as statecraft, as, saving lives, as installing democracy. But no one seems that bothered about it. And if really the goal is, not that, but if the goal is this, redirecting of, trillions of dollars from point A to point B, that kind of makes it explains the kind of serenity with which this administration is throwing human beings into an inferno. I mean, it's a horrible, horrible, shocking conclusion, but it makes a kind of satanic sense. I mean, it actually explains some historical events. But boy, this is really challenging. It's very painful. So why haven't people who share your viewpoint made more inroads in having prominent conservatives stand up and say, whoa, this is not what we meant?
Because prominent conservatives do mean what's happened. Because the conservative movement, I would argue largely, for the last 50 years, has been an engine of fascism. It's been an engine of growth for the empire and for the war. So their rhetoric has not been that. But, what else is new? They lie. But in actual fact, they've sought to bring about exactly this sort of operation. So, yeah, I mean, it's even in an earlier day. I mean, British, say, colonialism didn't make sense from the standpoint of the average person in England, let alone, of course, from the standpoint of the poor colonial citizen.
Right.
But it made sense for the power elite and for the state. So the American empire, was it Chomsky who said that only Athens and America have had gigantic empires and pretended they didn't have an empire? But we have this empire that is a rip-off operation. It's about transfer of wealth. It's about redistribution of wealth from the average person to the people connected to the empire, to all the big companies and the state itself and the military, and they're all doing very well. So, indeed, all the government failures, whether we look at things like public schools or the Federal Reserve or the empire, they're failures from our standpoint, but they're not failures from the standpoint of the people who are ripping us off. They're very happy about it.
Very happy, and I now believe, after going through this journey I went on of a kind of awakening for Give Me Liberty, that I actually think I now think the failures of public schools, it serves them. It serves these people in power to have a population of Americans who can barely read, who can't think critically, and half of whom, according to a number of studies, entering college, don't know what our republic is supposed to look like. They can't even recognize democratic processes, let alone recognize when they're being threatened, because civics is disappearing. I get that the way civics is taught is not, adequate from your point of view or mine, but, how much less adequate that half of American young people now don't get any civics at all. And so, kids are being interviewed in surveys who now say that the First Amendment goes too far. It's when you completely disempower a population and let them forget their legacy as Americans and as patriots and what their rights and freedoms are and what the system is supposed to look like according to the framers, that you can manipulate them more easily. And they're like, what? Well, okay, you can deploy troops